A good life is a life built around fulfilling work, play, relationships, and lifelong learning. Welcome to Good Life Conversations, where we explore the stories and strategies of inspiring everyday people who are striving to create a life of purpose, meaning, and connection. Hi there, welcome to another Good Life Conversation. My name is Jay. I'm the host and the founder of Thibodeau, and today's guest is Rachelle Thibodeau. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Jay. How are you?
I am good. I'm good. Thanks again for doing this. And I always like to introduce our guests by telling our audience a little bit about how we met. So Rachel and I met, it would have been probably close to 10 years ago now. Time flies. And we attended a conference. It was a student conference together. And Rachel is also in education. And we were sitting next to each other at a table for lunch. And Rachel was a very interesting person. She was there with a student, and she ended up telling me how she dropped out of high school when she was 16. She told me a little bit about the 15 or 20 jobs that she had had in the interim between dropping out of high school and that present day finishing up her PhD in psychology. A number of years later. So Rachel is now the coordinator for academic support programs at Carleton University. She has a really cool program that she runs that she can tell us a little bit about. But Rachel is a wonderful example for students of how just because you might stop doing something now doesn't mean you need to stop it forever, nor can you go back. So thanks again for being here, Rachel. And I'd love to dive right into the rapid fire questions, if that's okay with you.
Of course.
So the first question is, this is Good Life Conversations. The goal is that it's a holistic conversation where we talk a little bit about all the different parts of life that can contribute to a good life. So we'd like to just start by hearing a little bit about your day. If you want to tell us what time you wake up, do you have a morning routine? What's your work day look like? How much do you work? What do you do? Do you have any evening routines? Any things that are non-work related that you do in your day? Just tell us a little bit about a typical day in the life of Rachel.
All right. So my typical work day is usually from about 9:30 till 5:30. And that's not because I sleep in. I actually have a little insomnia, so I seldom make it, past 6 o'clock or so in bed, but I like a slow start. So my mornings involve a couple of cups of coffee, a nice breakfast, reading, maybe catching up on some emails if I need to do that. But I generally have a pretty mellow start to the day. If I'm working on campus, I usually incorporate about a half hour of walking or biking into my rather long commute to make sure I get a bit of exercise. And if I'm working from home, I usually get that exercise at lunchtime instead, just because, otherwise you start to grow roots into your chair. So I think it's nice to be able to get some movement in the day. And then my work day, one of the things I like most about my job is that it's really mixed. So, lots of days I have meetings, like I have about 20 or 30 staff in a given year. So a lot of my time is taken up meeting with them individually or in small groups, project groups. Other times I'll have weeks where I'm just sitting and writing curriculum or writing reports, analyzing data and things like that. So I like the variety. And let me see, in the evenings, by nature, I'm a homebody. I'm not always home, but I really do love to just get home from work, cook dinner while I listen to CBC radio. And then my partner and I relax playing board games, watching a show, reading, crosswords, gardening, that kind of domestic stuff I really enjoy. And I try to be asleep by 11:30 or 12, and it's always read in bed until the e-reader falls onto my face, and then I have to acknowledge the day is over and turn it off and go to sleep.
Very cool. Yeah. So we touched on a couple of the upcoming questions, I believe. I'm curious to know a couple things. What's your favorite board game?
Oh, currently we're obsessed with Rummikub. Do you know it?
I do know it. Yes. I played with my parents when we were younger. Classic.
Yeah. It's really, really fun. And then we like anything that's a word game, really. So we've got probably about 30 different games. Maybe one that people haven't heard of a lot is Word on the Street. That's a lot of fun.
Okay. Never heard of it.
There you
And
go.
when
You have to try.
I'll check it out, Word on the Street. And when you're falling asleep, when you're reading at night, do you have any particular type of book you like to read?
Yeah, I typically read fiction at night. Yeah. Um, I read a lot of nonfiction for my job, and in the morning when I wake up, I often read news, and before going to sleep, I try to stay away from the doom scrolling and just enjoy a good engrossing story.
Great. It's interesting to see some of the patterns that our mentors share who don't speak to each other necessarily about these questions at all, in fact. And this idea of making sure you get some kind of exercise every day, and often the idea of reading fiction before bedtime is also pretty common. So, and I think you mentioned you're a homebody. I'm curious to know, has that always been the case? How did you come to know that about yourself?
Um, yes, I think it has always been the case. And it's not that I'm a hermit, I go out lots, but I find I just have a certain balance where if I have to be out more than say 2 weeknight evenings, I just start to feel a bit frazzled, a bit unsettled.
Mm,
Um, and not only am I a homebody, but I really enjoy and benefit from time alone in the house.
mm.
Like just I probably because I grew up as an only child and I had lots of alone time, and I find that is something that I really need to sustain me, is just being by myself. I don't do anything particularly interesting. I probably just do the same things, cook, read, clean, but it just sort of resets me.
Mm.
Um, yeah. And then the other stuff, I go out and I do things and I'm involved in the community and all of that. But I think I feel the lack if I'm not at home, and I don't as much feel the lack if I'm not out.
Yeah. That's
Hmm.
interesting. Yeah. And this is just the kind of things that we are encouraging our students to pay attention to, and not seek to be somebody else, but really to kind of pay attention to the signals that they're getting from within. And it's interesting to me because I'm hearing you say these things, and that's a lot like my wife. She's much more of a homebody than me. And I see how comfortable she is to just not really, in my opinion, go out and have a lot of adventures. And she
Yeah.
seems so happy in that. And for me, it doesn't work. I need new things. I
Yeah.
need to try different stuff. So yeah, it's just good to pay attention and to honor that.
Yeah, my partner and I have the same mix. He would be out doing something adventurous
Hmm.
every day. And I'm like, go ahead, then I can be home alone.
It works. It works.
It works. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned reading and gardening, cooking, and board games. The next question is about any pastimes that you enjoy. Is there anything else to that list, or would you consider those things pastimes?
I would consider them pastimes. I would say um, if there's a thread that unites everything, it's probably I'm very passionate about the environment. That's been sort of a cause, I guess, that I've been involved in since I was a teenager, in the anti-nuclear movement in the 80s. And then in the 90s, when I came to university, it was more kind of holistic. I was part of a group called the Peace and Environment Resource Center for about 10 years, 9 or 10 years. And so now the cooking, it's vegetarian, local, sustainable food. So I'm really interested in that. This spring, my partner and I took a foraging class to learn more about how to eat the lawn and things
Whoa.
that grow in the natural environment. The gardening, that's a new passion. So it's all about we're developing a rain garden to stop runoff from going into the rivers and prevent flooding, and it's going to be all native species. So I'm learning about that. So yeah, I think like I would probably say cooking is my absolute favorite hobby as such. I mean, I love food, but I really love the creativity, cuisines from all over the world. I have like probably a couple hundred spices. I love just getting in the kitchen and seeing what I can invent, kind of thing.
Very interesting. And in the 1980s, I suspect environmentalism had not quite caught on in the masses as it has today, because obviously a lot of our listeners care about the environment. They're aware of global warming and some of the dangers that we're facing. So that must have been an interesting time before really it was quite popular. I imagine at that time it was probably not that many people.
Um, Yeah, I think it wasn't as popular as we would have liked. I sometimes feel like I spent, 20 years banging my head against the wall.
Mm.
But you know, what seems popular depends on who you're surrounded by. So as I was involved in things, everybody I knew cared
Mm.
about these things, or a lot of the people I knew cared and were very involved, or even more involved than I was. Most of the people I hung out with had careers in environment, and I didn't. Um, but yeah, I mean, it is a movement that's been going on for centuries, and people have been concerned about climate change since the 50s.
Mm.
So it's just taking us a while to catch on, I think.
Yeah, as it
Mhm.
usually does with a big movement like that. You touched on something that I'm curious about, and you mentioned, and I think this is very relevant for a lot of young people. And in particular, I have seen, I'm not sure if this is true for you and any students you work with, but in the last handful of years, my experience is that more and more students are identifying the environment as an area of study for them at the post-secondary level. And I think that's largely due to the conversation in social media and media at large about the environment. And so I'm curious, because you studied psychology when you came back to school, and now I'm learning, I did not know this about you, the environmental focus. So did you ever consider studying the environment or working in that domain?
Uh, Sort of. When I started university, I hadn't heard of anything like that, and it never crossed my mind that you could go to university and study and do something about the environment. I
Hmm.
heard of psychology. I knew one person who had been to university and she studied psychology, so I thought, oh, that. The only other thing I could think of to study was English, and I knew I didn't want to be a high school teacher. So like I really, really didn't have people around me who could advise me about these things, or I didn't know how to find the people who could advise me. So I would say no, when I was starting university, I didn't consider um, anything related to the environment. But later on, maybe when I was in about third year university and I started volunteering at the Peace and Environment Resource Center in Ottawa, I became aware of other aspects of psychology that I could study, and I considered for a while doing a master's degree in, say, peace education, or becoming more involved in nonprofit work, running workshops and training and education for citizens who wanted to become involved in activism and things like that. But for various life reasons, I ended up sort of staying local to Ottawa. The university that I studied at and work at now didn't have those offerings, and then I got my first job at the place that I work now, and then took that hard turn toward education, and no regrets at all. Like I really, really love what I do.
I love this message for the reason that I think a lot of young people today fundamentally have this idea that they need to identify the thing that they care about the most in the world by the time they're 18, and pursue that thing in its entirety and completely, and devote their lives to that. And here we have someone who, I have heard and seen from you that you really enjoy the work that you do. You have a lot of other interests, and you came into it, sounds like, quite haphazardly, and you perhaps learned that you liked psychology. Is that the case, that you just kind of learned that, oh, this is actually interesting to me, and you carried on?
I think I had an interest in psychology from a young age. I had family members who had some mental health challenges who benefited from um, counseling, and I don't know. I'm not exactly sure where it came from, but I think I always had a bit of a psychological turn of mind, like a tendency to look at the world through that lens a little bit. So the interest in psychology was always there. It's the interest in education and helping people through their education that was something that just kind of landed in my lap, and immediately felt like a great fit.
Yeah. Okay, well,
Mhm.
I think that's interesting, and we can go on. But the message that I would love to share or pinpoint here is that here's Rachel. She had this inkling that she enjoyed psychology. She pursued it, And then she learned about education as an interest, as an additional interest. And all the while, she continued pursuing that interest of, I'm sure, other things as well. But in this basic example, psychology that led to education. And then also she has continued throughout to care about the environment and to learn about it and to help create a better environment. So the message is that you can do more than just one thing in meaningful ways.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this idea that you have to choose one thing and you have to choose it when you're young and you have to know what it's called already. Like, I didn't know what things were at all, what was available when I was that age. And so I think just being open to the things around you and pursuing new experiences and saying yes to opportunities can take you down really fulfilling paths in life that you just didn't even know were there until you just, landed in your face kind of thing.
Oh, yes. It sounds like a productive discovery year, what you're
Yeah.
describing. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. The next question is about failure. And normally we ask very simplistically for our guests to tell us about an important or recent failure. But if you don't mind, I'm happy to hear another failure. But I don't know how you would frame this idea of dropping out from high school when you were 16, but I think that's such an interesting and compelling story. Could you tell us about that? And maybe you might
Yeah.
say, Jay, that wasn't a failure at all. And you'd correct me, but I'd love to hear a little bit about why that happened, how you ended up back in school. What was it? Tell us a little bit about that journey, if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind at all. I mean, I guess you would call it a failure. Certainly, my parents were not too impressed with my choice, and society doesn't see you as a success if you drop out of high school. Um, I think at the time I saw it as temporary. So things were a little bit rocky at home. Family life was not going great at that time, and I from the pretty much the beginning of high school, I didn't really go to school very much. I just was disengaged. I was a great student up to grade 8, straight A's, loved school, into books, all of that. And then when I went to high school, something just shifted both at home and in me, I guess. And I got a job. I got a job at a carpet cleaning company. I'd phone people all day long saying, "Hey, you want your carpets cleaned?" And I just became sort of more focused on going to work and making money, and school was not interesting. I didn't like the people there. I didn't like the vibe there. It wasn't a great school. Teachers didn't notice I wasn't there, I don't think. Certainly no one ever called home to say, "Hey, where's your kid?"
Wow.
And so it wasn't that I didn't think I needed an education or wanted an education. I just was like, this is not for me right now. And so I worked for a few years. I tried to get back into schooling a number of times before I finally made it to university. I signed up for something that was like a alternative school, I suppose. I went for 1 or 2 days, didn't feel that's just no sense of belonging. Like I didn't get the environment. It wasn't for me. And then I did hairdressing for 2 or 3, 4 years, sort of on and off. I wasn't very good at it. And I didn't really like it. And then I ended up moving to the UK with a boyfriend who was going over there for work. And then I, traveled around for a few years, working this job and that job, mostly working in casinos. And always in my mind was the thought that I would go to university. It wasn't like, oh, one day I woke up and thought, geez, my life is not good. I need to go to university. It was always kind of there. It was just a matter of figuring out when. And I didn't feel a ton of urgency. Like I was 24 when I started university, and that seemed perfectly fine. And I started by just taking a couple of classes. So I was back in New Brunswick By that time, I took a couple of classes through the extension program, which meant university classes offered at the local high school. I didn't do very well. um, Tried a couple more, and by the time I had maybe 3 credits under my belt, I was ready. And then when I started school full time, it was just like, oh yeah, this is how it's supposed to be.
Amazing. Sounds like you did a really great job, almost I might say an outstanding job of listening to what your inner self was telling you about what was right for you at the time, which I think shows a lot of maturity, which is ironic because most people would say if you drop out of school, you're immature. So I think that's an interesting slant on the story. I don't know if you agree, but it sounds like based on the way you're describing it now, it was a lot of fairly mature decisions at the time.
Well, I think probably the more mature decision would have been to say high school isn't what you want it to be, so just grit your teeth and get through it.
Hmm.
Um, uh, but who knows? In hindsight, yes, but then again, I wouldn't be who I am today if I hadn't had the life that I've had and the experiences that I've had, and certainly dropping out of high school and having that kind of circuitous route back into education has, I think, made me better at the work that I do now, which is helping other people get into and through their education. So I don't regret it, but I don't know if I would characterize it as a particularly mature decision.
Okay, fair. Thank
Mhm.
you. Yeah. And I love the idea that you reflect back and you think I started when I was 24 and that felt like the right time. I imagine that you enjoyed what you were learning about and you had the motivation to do the work. And I went back to school for my master's when I was 30 and I had a very similar experience where I was like, oh, this is what school can be like. It was
Yes.
enlightening. It was refreshing. So I think that's important because we have a lot of young people who feel that if they're not at university by the time they're 18 or even earlier, feel like that's a failure. They feel that they're behind. And so it's important to hear 24 might sound like a light year away.
And I've had many students over the years in their 30s and 40s and 50s, and it's not going to be the same as being in school when you're 18 or 19, but it's a different experience, and many mature students really flourish and love being in school, and feel like, depending what else is going on in your life, it can feel less distracting because you don't have all that same focus on socializing and peers. When I was 24, I had no interest in hanging out with the people in my classes for the most part. They were, very, very young compared to me. So I made a few friends who were like me, a bit older, more serious about school. And yeah, I don't regret coming later at all.
Very cool.
Hmm.
Okay. Thank you. So I'd like to jump into, talking about not necessarily wanting to hang out with 18-year-olds when you're 24 leads us into the next question that I want to ask you in some way, which is if you can share a lesson that you've learned about relationships. Relationships, of course, well documented as an important part of a good life. So what have you learned about relationships?
Gosh. I will start by saying I'm in no position to give anyone else advice about relationships. However, some of the harder lessons that I've learned, I think it takes a lot of self-knowledge to be good at relationships. So to really, for me, taking the time to really reflect on me and to learn to not ignore what's going on internally when it comes to relationships has been uh,
Hmm.
a hard and ongoing process. Learning to have the courage to say what's really in my heart, and not to sort of sit on issues until they're at the boiling point. That has taken some time and still something that I'm working on. And I think another thing that I've learned about relationships is that I really need to treasure and prioritize my non-romantic relationships. My friendships are everything to me. I have been so fortunate to have a small group of friends that I've had for decades, and they've been there through all the ups and downs in my life. And that, for me, that is the site of longevity. Apart from my parents, my brother, they're the people who have been there the longest. And that is just so valuable to have those folks who really know you, who know all the stuff you've been through, and who you trust to tell you what's real and what's not real when you're in a spot where you need some advice or some support.
Mm.
That's been absolutely essential.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that it's an ongoing pursuit. And we tend to hear that at least once in these conversations from our mentors, which is an important message to say, hey, we're a bit older and we are still figuring it out. Because I think that's a message that young people don't often hear, that I think the expectation is that by the time you get to 21 or 25 years old, you have all the answers.
Maybe somebody does, but that's not me.
Me neither. Me neither. Okay, I'd love to jump into a fun one here. And as you know, travel is an essential part of a discovery year. So our students have to travel somewhere. So can you tell us the favorite place that you've ever traveled and why you love it?
Gosh, there are so many, but I would say my favorite way to travel is to live somewhere else and not just to visit somewhere else. And my favorite place that I've lived is London, England. So I was pretty young when I got there, maybe 19 or so, I think, or 20. And I was there for a couple of years, and I loved the busyness of it. I grew up, I'm originally from New Brunswick, but grew up in Scarborough. So in my heart, I feel like a city person. And the hustle and bustle and the diverse cultures of London, the different languages. The first thing I saw when I got off the plane in London was a huge, like maybe thousands of Tamils arriving. I think they were refugees, and I'd never seen so many different people at one time, like from one other culture. And it was just like, that was the theme of London for me, was just the incredible diversity of people there. Food culture, of course, I really started to learn how to cook different cuisines when I lived in London. And I think part of why it was such a great experience is that I was alone living in London. And I have a lot of fond memories of just, taking the tube to some random stop that I'd never heard of before and just getting off and walking and, walking for a few hours, discovering a new neighborhood, and just having all that time to myself exploring was really wonderful.
That's interesting. And I think I can't help but think about the seeming juxtaposition or complexity of the idea of Rachel, who told us earlier that you're a homebody and you like to not be out too much. And then this idea of going to a random stop around London, and was that kind of, a couple days. But I want to say that I like that. At least it sounds somewhat conflicting to me. And I think that's important that we highlight that humans are complicated people with different needs, and it's a moving target. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Did you do that in small doses, or was that something you did every day?
No, not every day. And I'll tell you honestly how it started is I have the world's worst sense of direction. Like, I'm sure that is verifiable through some kind of neurological test. It's shockingly bad. And I just started because I would be trying to go to a certain place in London, see this well-known neighborhood or go to this bookstore or restaurant or whatever, and I would always get lost. So I just kind of gave up on trying to go where I meant to go, and just, I think one day, just got off at the wrong stop or whatever and walked around, and it was a good experience. So then I did it some more and just thought, well, if I can't get where I mean to go, I'll just enjoy where I end up. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say it was an everyday thing at all, but I probably did it, 10 or 15 times in the couple of years that I was there. And those are really treasured memories.
Very cool. Turning lemons into lemonade, it sounds like. Yeah. What could have been a mistake or a failure,
Yeah.
you turned into, which is a great lesson. Those are the kind of anecdotes that we seek out because many people could have gone to the wrong stop and, spoken harshly to themselves or berated themselves or said, you're an idiot or whatever. But instead I don't know if that happened briefly for you, but you
Oh,
came
all
right.
that too. Yeah, all that too. Or standing on a street corner crying, going, "Oh, why can't I figure out how to go anywhere?"
Yeah.
And then just kind of trying to bounce back from that and
Mm.
something enjoyable anyway.
That's great, and we talk often with our students and even parents about that threshold of pain, whatever the pain might be, to get through to the other side. And we want to encourage young people to persist through that for a period of time. We never know how long it'll take, right? But that's something that sometimes I think is a misunderstanding today, that people can get right to the moment where they appreciate the difficult and it's all rainbows and butterflies. But of course there's that period where we're uncertain or we're having difficulties and we got to push through it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think I got a lot of that from my parents. If things are hard, we generally compare downward, meaning things might be hard for me right now, but at least it's not like this other person or these other people who maybe people I know or don't know, but I always have that tendency because that's the way my parents, they both grew up very, very poor, but not knowing they were poor because there was somebody down the street who was worse off. So if something seems hard, I don't have the tendency to go, why is it hard? Why can't it be easy like somebody up there who looks like they have it easy? I just think, oh, thank goodness it's not worse.
oh, that's so interesting. And a conversation that I had, a related conversation with many people during COVID, was this
Mhm.
balance of maintaining that perspective like you're describing and saying, okay, well, it's bad, but it could be worse, or I should be grateful for the things that I have, which of course is true. And then the other side of that might be that people will continuously, just if they think it's not as bad but still have negative emotions or difficult thoughts, they might get even more hard on themselves. So I think perhaps we don't have time in a conversation. I'm sure these are things that you've thought about and explored in psychology, but I do think it's an interesting conversation, one that we have often with our students, this idea of maintaining perspective and focusing on gratitude, and at the same time enabling ourselves to feel what we're feeling when it's difficult, and to working
Yeah.
through it. I just find myself, that's not a balance that seems to be well managed often these days.
It's not a natural one for me either. I would say I'm much more inclined to sort of ignore any bad feelings that I have. But what has really helped me with that is that I work with young people and I'm constantly trying to teach them, how important it is to take care of yourself, how it's okay to have bad feelings or difficult times, that you need to look after your mental health and so on. So then I feel like a total hypocrite if I don't do these things for myself. So I kind of tell myself, and I also tell my leadership team, like, if you can't do those things for yourself, do it for the people you're mentoring. And then it becomes, at least for me, it has become more of a natural feeling habit. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, I'd love one more question, and then we'll wrap up with any advice that you might have for students. So the question I'd love to ask you is, you work with a lot of young people. You mentioned you have a large staff. I imagine at least some of those people are relatively new to the workforce.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, we're often chatting with our students about the behaviors, attitudes, mindsets that will help them excel in any work that they do in their lives, in their careers. So from your perspective, besides any type of paper or degree that someone might bring with them when you might be hiring them or working with them, what are the attributes that you think are most important for a young person that you might be looking to hire?
Oh, so if I could put some context around that, like the job that I'm hiring young people for is to work with other younger students who may be struggling with their academic skills or with their motivation and things like that. And so the people that I'm looking to hire have to have compassion. I tend to look for people who, yes, have good academic skills now, but who have had to work for it. I think it's not as easy to be a strong mentor if that side of things has always come easily for you or easily to you. And so people who have had some bumps along the way, I think, are really valuable members of my team because they've learned from their mistakes. They've seen that you can bounce back, and all of those really help them to help other people. I also think the ability to be vulnerable is, I guess, related to what I've just been saying, but to be willing to make mistakes, to not have a big mask on, but to when you're working to help other people, to show that you're human and you're not perfect, and that you learn and grow from mistakes is really key. And then I look for all the good employee stuff: being reliable, being consistent, being I would say self-motivated to a certain extent, like just having that desire to be conscientious and do the things that you have committed to doing. I don't have the time with the number of employees that I have to call everybody into my office and say, hey, how come you're not meeting your deadlines? Where's your paperwork? Where's this? If I'm meeting with you, I want us to talk about more interesting things, like how can I help you grow in your leadership capacities, or what are the things that you're struggling to support students with? I don't want to be having conversations about why you're late for a meeting. Like just do that stuff automatically without me needing to deal with you.
That's great. Thank you. And I love the context about the particularities of the role, and then the kind of the broader attributes that you're looking for, kind of regardless of the role. And it mirrors a lot of what I've heard over the years and what I've experienced myself in terms of qualities. And what I find interesting is that it's just not that well known. I think there's not a ton of people telling young people that these are really fundamentally the most important things, being on time, being respectful, and being compassionate, and sharing mistakes, and being proactive. So thank you.
Yeah, I always say I can train you to do everything. Like that's not a problem. But if the person isn't there, if that ultimate decency, honesty, kindness, reliability, those are characteristics I can't teach you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I feel like I've heard a thread here through the conversation for me has been self-knowledge, the importance of self-knowledge, to be aware of what's right for you at any given time, and to know if you should be out every night or should you be home every night, and to be able to kind of attend to those messages that you're getting from yourself. And then also the self-knowledge that's required in relationships to get a sense of, what's working for you, what's working for the other person. A lot of great wisdom. And I would love to end, if you have any last words of advice framed around this idea that young people, as I experience it today, often look into their screens rather than looking out, I would say, and they see a world where people seem to have it all together, and everyone is thriving and killing it and making tons of money, and everyone's beautiful and living their best lives. And of course, we know very clearly that that's not the case, that everyone goes through difficulties. And so this is about the good life. So what advice would you offer, given the context of the world that young people are coming into adulthood today? What advice would you offer for any young person to continue along this continuous journey to the good life?
Okay, it's a big ask. I would say, today, at least for young people who are looking out at the natural environment and what's happening, there's a lot to worry about. There's a lot to be concerned about. And I guess that's probably true of every generation, but I feel it very acutely now, looking at, what's coming in the future. And I would say it's very normal to feel anxious and worried, whether it's about those big issues or whether it's about, relationships or school or whatever it may be. And that what I've noticed in the last 20 or so years is that a lot of young people seem to have received the message that anxiety is really bad and should be avoided at all costs. And what I know and what we know based on psychological research is that avoidance makes it worse. And so, I'm not here to give clinical advice to somebody who has a diagnosis of a serious anxiety disorder, but I do know that even for those folks who are suffering from a disorder, the treatment protocols don't involve just avoiding everything that makes you feel anxious. It just sets up a cycle where I feel anxious about this social interaction, therefore I avoid it. Now I feel better. And the next time I face the same challenge, my only solution is to go back into avoidance. And so a better way to approach it, whether it's on your own or with help of a professional counselor, is to get some help with how you think about things. So cognitive behavior therapy, or just understanding that you may be exaggerating how bad things are. Catastrophizing is a word that psychologists use about that. And also to gradually, gently, compassionately expose yourself to the things you're afraid of. So gradual is really, really important there. You don't want to get into a situation where you're trying things that are too scary and you make things worse. So finding that way to have very small steps, I think is really, really important. Otherwise, you end up hiding and not living your life, and that doesn't improve anything. So tolerating some discomfort and knowing that things will get easier with practice and gentle exposure, I think is really, really important for folks to know.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. And we certainly see, a significant percentage of our students who deal with anxiety and other mental health challenges. So I think it will be much appreciated, that advice. Okay. Thanks very much, Rachel. It's been a pleasure as always. I appreciate you being vulnerable yourself with everybody and sharing your story and some great anecdotes and experiences. So thank you.
Always
Thanks
great to
everybody for
talk to you,
listening.
Jay.
Yes. Thanks everybody for listening. This has been another Good Life conversation. We look forward to having you at the next.